we can kind of see with this image, it's a widely circulating idea, sort of on the broad left, as well as in kind of the more niche sort of circles of online tanky forums and so on, that Stalinism was the key force that defeated fascism in the 20th century. But what I'm going to argue today is that rather than being the key force that challenged fascism, I want to rather kind of contend that Stalinist politics both enabled and collaborated with fascist movements, parties and states. More than that, I'm also going to argue that communist parties in country after country were one of the key forces that undermined the kind of revolutionary working class movements that might have actually been capable of smashing fascism for good. So rather than, as Emma said, this kind of Stalinist fan art that you kind of see above, I would say that the real story of the relationship between Stalinism and fascism is something much more like this. My online, God, there we go. All right. Down. Before I come to some of the most kind of historic examples, I think it's just worth offering a few definitional comments and a bit of periodization about where I'm actually talking. Because today, I'm not going to kind of give a sense of the whole of the kind of, global 21st and 20th century kind of combat between Stalinism and fascism, but much more focusing in on the interwar period, the period of the kind of 30s and 40s, which is really kind of the high point in many ways of both the Stalinist movements and the fascist movements. So that's the kind of period I want to talk about. And the kind of fascist movements, I think it's just worthwhile saying a couple of things. Rather than a whole raft of analysis which really sees fascism as separate to and in some ways opposed to capitalism, I think it is absolutely vital that we see that fascism is part of, and really in many ways, the kind of apogee of the worst elements of capitalism itself. And I think that analysis really matters if we're going to understand why exactly Stalinism not only facilitated fascism, but also undermined the very force that had the capacity to overthrow fascism for once and all. Secondly, I just want to say a few words about communism and the Stalinist regimes. The Soviet Union was undeniably a barbaric and dictatorial state that came to counter-revolutionary power by crushing the spine of a genuinely revolutionary movement that emerged in Russia in 1917. The ruling class of the Soviet Union not only liquidated all political opposition, but organised a social system that was violently and brutally exploitative of its working class. And it was a system that ruled by terror on an absolutely vast, vast scale. And in many ways, although this would come as a kind of shock to many of the sort of tankies who lurk online today, I would actually say that there is more in common between Stalinism and fascism and the social systems that they engendered as states, than there is more that distinguishes them. But as the counter-revolutionary power of Stalinism was consolidated domestically in the 1920s, the USSR not only kind of aspired to, and the Soviet state not only aspired to rule domestically, they also wanted to expand their power and control across the world. And so it really entered the period of kind of inter-imperial colonial, battles and competition that existed from the 1930s onwards, and really until the collapse of the Eastern Bloc in the 1990s, and it remained a real key player in capitalist national competition. But the USSR was an unusual beast. It's kind of a strange phenomena in the world because it said one thing and it did another. The spark of the Russian Revolution was extremely difficult to quash, the USSR, for many millions of workers and militants across the world, could really seem to embody all of their hopes and dreams for a better world and a better life. And so it could seem to embody that while trashing them in reality. And so the language of communism was absolutely bastardized by both the USSR and its international organizing body, the Comintern, and by many national communist parties across the world. So to kind of move on to some of the historic specificities. For those who want to extol the virtues of the Red Army during World War II, as kind of that first image really exemplifies, I think it is very politically expedient to stay quiet about the pre-war fascist movements. It's as though in many of the narratives, and if you kind of trawl through them online, history really only begins once the Soviet Union enters the war in 1941, and then it ends after the death of Hitler. But for anyone who is serious about combating fascism, it is vital to consider how these fascist movements come to power in the first place. And it's here that the questions of anti-fascist politics and the ways in which they organised and mobilised, and the politics of the communist parties themselves come into play. And so I'm going to focus here particularly on Germany and Spain. Okay, all right. So the German Communist Party, or the KPD, as I'm going to refer to it from here on in, was basically by the 1920s fully Stalinised. It was following the Comintern's line. And in 1928, as part of justifying an internal offensive against his domestic opposition, and as a means for kind of purging the global communist parties of any opposition to his line, Stalin developed something known as the Third Period. And translated into a program for the communist movement globally, the Third Period declared that capitalism would soon be convulsed by intense crises. Imperialist war was imminent and revolution was on the agenda. And social democratic parties in this context became the prime enemy. And so often with barely a distinction made between the leadership of these parties and their rank and file working class membership, reformist parties were declared social fascist and were, more often than not, the primary target of the communist parties. And just as a brief aside, in some of my research that I've been doing for my PhD, I've been looking through all of the Australian Communist Party newspapers of the day, and the attacks against the Australian Labor Party are virulent, and almost, in every single edition, almost on every single page, there is some attack on the Australian Labor Party, declaring them fascists and so on. So, this is really the kind of tone and dynamic of where many of the communist parties across the world are directing their fire. But in Germany, it was an absolutely disastrous political line. The working class in Germany had been one of the most militant and politically radical of anywhere in the world. But unfortunately, a significant post-World War I upsurge was pushed back, and by the late 1920s, a fascist movement, organised primarily in the Nazi Party, but not only, was beginning to gain serious ground. Nevertheless, so, these fascists started to organise, but hundreds of thousands of militants remained in either the Socialist Party or in the KPD, and they were impelled into anti-fascist action. There was just no choice for many of them, because the fascists were kind of on the march against them, their institutions and their organisations, their newspapers, and, their militants in many workplaces. So just to give you a sense of the scale of the thing, the KPD, by 1932, had organised 300,000 members. And one particularly great historian of this period, Dave Renton, also argues that the KPD could, in addition, call on the support of Red unions, organisations of schools and university associations, fellow travellers in Red sports clubs, and in the KPD-dominated anti-Nazi networks, such as the Anti-Fascista Action, or the AFA. And this is this image here is of one of their banners that they took on some of the big mobilisations. And the AFA actually claimed in 1932 100,000 members. So that is on top of the 300,000 that the KPD actually had. So you can kind of get a sense from those numbers that this is not it's not the majority of the working class, undeniably, but they had an important role to play in arguing to militants, organised workers, and the like about what kind of anti-fascist action should be taken. And here is another image. This is of the Anti-Fascist Action's headquarters. And you can see they kind of tried to draw together a variety of kind of elements of anti-fascism, the broader kind of political situation against war and hunger and so on. Nevertheless, between 1929 and the beginning of the economic collapse in 1933, Hitler's coming to power, thousands of working class communists across Germany fought the Nazis in their workplaces and on the streets. And these battles cost hundreds of KPD members their lives, but the general strategy of the party was absolutely disastrous, because they saw these battles as kind of marginal, whereas the main battle was really against the social fascists of the SPD. Indeed, the party's newspaper regularly declared that fascism was actually already in power before Hitler came to power himself, in the form of both Social Democratic and then the Centre Party. And in a number of instances, this actually led to a very unholy alliance between the Nazis and the KPD. So they actually worked together on a number of campaigns to keep the SPD out of power. And, you know, this is an absolutely kind of tragic and, you know, appalling kind of moment in Stalinist history. By 1932, while the Nazis were growing, broader bourgeois forces were in disarray. And in 1933, in the elections then, the Nazi party had, basically got elected, and Hitler gathered together enough electoral forces to consolidate broader power. He outlawed all opposition parties, he purged the state of any dissenting voices, and he began a reign of terror over the population. Now, in the afternoon of Hitler's victory, the Central Committee of the KPD began issuing leaflets, and this is in the afternoon of the election. You know, so Hitler comes to power, you know, basically there'd been kind of sporadic, you know, KPD-led organising, some street battles here or there, but nothing centrally organised and determined, because there'd been all this political confusion kind of in the lead up to this moment. So Hitler's elected, the KPD issues a leaflet demanding strikes, mass strikes, general strikes on the afternoon of Hitler's election. So virtually no major preparatory work done in the entire period. But, you know, and so the call was pretty empty, and nothing significant had been done to build this kind of action beforehand. So mass confusion reigned. And for far too long, the party had been declaring the SPD the main fascist threat. And so while many in the rank and file of the KPD could see the truth of the situation, it was really too late. Their resistance was kind of sporadic and disorganised. So there were strikes, there were some street battles between both KPD and SPD members on the streets of Germany. But again, this did nothing significant to kind of push back the fascist threat. So again, the kind of politics of Stalinism here led to an absolutely disastrous, disorganised anti-fascist movement that politically was taking entirely the wrong political perspective. And the consequences of this were just absolutely shocking. Nearly every third KPD member went to prison under Nazi rule, and thousands were murdered. And I, unfortunately for time, I kind of had to cut down this talk, but, you know, I was reading through a bunch of the accounts of German communists in the period, and one of them described the kind of taking of many of the kind of KPD militants and working class leaders as, you know, happening stealthily, you know, behind the scenes with some violence, till all of a sudden, and he described it as being left with a room that is full of bookshelves but with no books, and that kind of feeling of just unease and disquiet and, you know, grief at the kind of the situation. Okay, so I want to kind of move on now to Spain. Because after the ascension of Mussolini and then Hitler, fascist movements across the world gained a lot of confidence. While the consolidation of fascism in Italy, Austria, and Germany represented a real serious body blow to the workers' movement, there was actually still parts of the world where workers fought on. And Spain was the next major battleground. And it was here where the last major stand against fascism was fought. And it was also here where the politics of a consolidated Stalinist rule was revealed. By 1934, just 1 year after the Nazis came to power, the Stalinist ruling class changed tack. The third period was declared over, and a new approach, exemplified by something called the Popular Front, began. And again, there was nothing objective in the situation that necessitated such a change. Rather, it was just prompted by the requirements of the Stalinist ruling class. So by 1934, Stalin had defeated one of his key rivals in the bureaucracy, in the Soviet bureaucracy, Bukharin, and he was absolutely determined to smash any more general or potential opposition. So he was kind of on the lookout for any force that might kind of rise to challenge his authority and rule. And so inside the USSR, brutal purges of the state bureaucracy were accompanied by high-profile show trials of former Bolsheviks and many kind of leaders of the working class. And internal political considerations were just part of this picture, though, because there was also a whole bunch of kind of inter-imperial power plays, which actually really affected the ways in which the Soviet state was starting to try kind of an orient at this time. So within a year of Hitler's rule, it became clear that Germany was starting to prepare for war. The USSR in that kind of context would be a target, and Stalin began to try and work out ways to protect Soviet state capitalism. And these included actually maintaining the Treaty of Rapallo, which was an agreement with Germany. So much for kind of this anti-fascist kind of positioning from the very beginning. The Stalinist Soviet government maintained a treaty with fascist Germany, but the Soviet government also wanted to develop an alliance with Britain and France. And those intersecting dynamics provoked a new political turn, which was designed to reroute all of the Comintern parties across the world. So basically at the next Comintern international meeting, the leaders of the Comintern declared, the third period was over. They denounced all of the terrible ultra-leftism that meant that Hitler came to power. So there was sort of seemed to be an element of kind of self-criticism in the way that they were approaching the situation and their previous anti-fascism. But a figure called Georgy Dimitrov actually gave a speech at this, which elaborated on anti-fascism as the main global platform for which was basically to kind of orient all of the parties. But what this anti-fascism actually looked like and meant was just the elevation of Soviet international policy, to a kind of a grand scale. And so fascism, rather than being, the kind of mass movement of kind of forces, middle-class forces and so on, was primarily understood within the framework of international state politics. And so unity became a catch cry. Now, for Trotskyists and for many, unity actually would have been a good thing in Germany, unity between social democratic workers and communist workers. But what Dimitrov actually meant when he was talking about unity had nothing to do with kind of rank and file workers standing together, defeating fascism in their workplaces on the streets. What unity meant for Dimitrov was unity between the states, between France and Britain and the USSR. And what's more, now it meant unity between classes. So unity between the middle class forces, unity between the bourgeoisies of different countries and the communist workers themselves. And all of this was to be achieved under the auspices of the League of Nations. So that kind of policy in Spain was revealed to be counter-revolution. An attempted right-wing coup in 1936 prompted an immediate, instinctive, and in parts of the country, really successful working class and peasant uprising. And you can see here some of the absolutely beautiful images of peasants and workers starting to mobilize against the fascists. They organised in some of the most just creative kind of, working class organisations and organs. At times, they displayed extremely violent revolutionary action, but they managed to hold off the far-right forces for a whole period. And the social revolution just displayed amazing feats of anti-fascism. Despite having few weapons, they utilised their social weight and their bravery to fight the fascists. But from our perspective, and these images should have fired the kind of souls of anti-fascists across the world, including the Stalinists, but it was actually not universally welcomed. After all, to encourage this kind of anti-fascist action threatened to spill over into a broader challenge to all of the kind of social structures which existed in Spain and more generally. It threatened to upend capitalist power relations. And so between July of 1936 and May of 1937, there developed a situation of something like dual power in the Republican zones in Spain. So on one side, there was the nominally anti-fascist bourgeois republican government, and this force had no real power over society. And on the other side, mainly in the industrial state of Catalonia, there were vast networks of peasants and workers who controlled the economy, justice, transport, education, basically everything that was happening in the country. And it was that force that had the capacity, the real power to overthrow and defeat fascism. But basically that kind of situation was, again, not welcomed by the Stalinists. They were, basically rushing towards trying to compel Britain and France to sign a non-intervention pact. And their ruling classes basically had no interest in helping the Spanish working class defeat fascism. And the USSR basically, encouraged their Spanish affiliates in Spain, the Communist Party there, to do everything that they could to undermine this genuine revolutionary power. So the Soviet Union poured thousands of advisors and agents into Spain. They helped direct a major counter-revolutionary offensive against the anarchists and independent communists who were involved in the working class agitation. Soviet secret forces rounded up and murdered many working class revolutionaries, most notably Andrei Nin, who was one of the leaders of the independent communist opposition. And in this way, the revolutionary aspect of the Spanish Civil War was defeated. So it was defeated, and here we have to come back. It was defeated not by the fascists, it was defeated and it was drowned in blood by the Stalinists themselves. The Soviet Union didn't want to engage in any conflagration that might push Britain and France further into their arms, so they invested just enough to keep fighting, but not enough to decisively win this battle. And in the end, the Republican and Stalinist forces were defeated, and it was clear that World War was on the horizon. So with that kind of prehistory out of the way, which, I would say if I was litigating this case, well, if I was a lawyer and if I was litigating this case, that would be quite a lot to kind of indict the Stalinists. But basically, let's move on to World War II, because this is when the kind of history that the Stalinists love to kind of talk about, begins. And this is when the kind of glorious Red Army kind of comes into its own. But I would again say that we cannot just start with the intervention of the Red Army into the war. I would say let's turn back and have a little look at the period between 1941 onwards. Well, really from in the period the period before 1941. Because during this period, there was another series of kind of quite dizzying twists and turns in communist policy when it came to fascism. From 1936 until 1939, the Comintern, and therefore all the communist parties across the world, had shifted their rhetorical focus. German and Italian fascism was the main threat to world peace. There were now fascist nations, which were the enemy, and there were sympathetic, democratic, peace-loving nations, which were all the Allied forces. And that kind of rhetoric lasted for a period of time. And, the next period, the kind of twist, is the thing that lots of Stalinists prefer to forget. So defenders of the Stalinist line basically maintained that this was the major battle, that capitalist democracy was at stake, socialism was off the agenda, and therefore there needed to be a battle which was waged to defend basic bourgeois rights. Once fascism was broken, only then could the class struggle be picked up again. Now, for anti-Stalinist revolutionaries, that kind of approach is fundamentally flawed. Fascism cannot be fought within the bounds of bourgeois democracy. Anti-fascist struggles that limit themselves to parliamentary and legalistic means are basically doomed to fail. Mass, united, revolutionary working class struggle was the only kind of movement that could have defeated mass fascist movements. But for the Stalinists, they put aside class struggle in the Allied countries. They said all of this is off the agenda. And to do that basically muted any anti-fascist, genuine rank and file anti-fascist resistance in those countries. What's more, the idea that the ruling classes of Britain and France had any interest, these peace-loving democratic nations, had any interest at all in seriously challenging fascism was absolutely laughable. Like half the ruling classes in these countries loved fascism. They loved Hitler, they loved Mussolini, you know, all of the kind of scandals of bloody William, you know, Prince William getting decked out in the, you know, Nazi outfits. That had historical precedent. That didn't come from nowhere. You know, he was probably just channeling the spirit of his grandfather. But, you know, like that was the case across Europe. So there was no ideological hostility to fascism. This was all about inter-imperial rivalry. And lots of this kind of came to the fore in the Hitler-Stalin pact. In 1939, having failed to pressure France or Britain into backing the USSR, Stalin decided to sign a non-aggression pact with fascist Germany. And this cartoon was actually done by an Australian cartoonist. I don't know if people can read it. It says, the scum of the earth, I believe. And then Stalin says, the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. But, you know, it kind of gives you a flavour for the dynamic, you know, the kind of polite coming together of these two powers to kind of negotiate. And the pact was justified at the time, and actually subsequently of many on the left, as a clever tactic. They kind of talk about it in these terms. It was just a tactic by Stalin, designed to save the only communist state in the world, the USSR, from fascist aggression. But in reality, it was not just a tactic, and it wasn't just a non-aggression pact. Actually, it was very aggressive. It was a major land grab on the part of the USSR. What's more, surrounding the signing of the pact, there were a number of top secret conferences between the Gestapo and the NKVD, which was Stalin's secret police. And one of their main goals was to combat the Polish underground that was now working simultaneously against both the Soviet state and the Nazis. And the NKVD agreed to work against all anti-Nazi Polish propaganda on the Soviet-controlled areas of the former Polish Republic. So here you can actually see these are the Soviet forces and the Nazi forces together, standing together in this hot, you know, period just after communist parties across the world, and Stalin had talked about the importance of being an anti-fascist, together organising against the Polish underground in the period. And there's lots of talk about, oh, it was all just because the Polish, you know, underground was fascist too. But all of that is, you know, actually rubbish. And what this was about controlling area, land, establishing Soviet control and rule. And what's more, even more shamefully, during these conferences, Stalin also agreed to transfer German communists who had escaped Hitler to the USSR, fearing for their lives, activists who had fought and, you know, feared to even survive, who had gone to the USSR for, you know, respite, for care. Stalin basically organised to transfer these people back to the Third Reich. So hundreds and hundreds of them were put on trains and sent to their deaths. And you can actually read the stories of many of them. You know, they fight Hitler, you know, leave there for fear of their lives, go to the USSR, you know, put into camps there, transferred back to Germany, put into death camps in Germany. Some of them are then transferred back from Germany to the USSR. You know, and some of the stories are just people who spend 40 years going from death camp to death camp. And this is the blood of German communists on the hands of the Stalinists. So after the pact, because this isn't the end of the story, the Comintern now declared that the coming war wasn't actually an anti-fascist war anymore. It ceased to be an anti-fascist war. It was transformed into a supportable war, to an imperialist war, into an insupportable war. It was now an imperialist war against which the communist parties across the world would now fight. So from 1939 until 1941, much of the anti-fascist rhetoric was dumped, just gone in the click of an instant, just disappeared. And it was replaced with condemnations of the imperial designs of the Anglo-French alliance. So you can just see communist parties across the world just dumped all the anti-fascist rhetoric, which many, you know, people had felt to be the reason that they had joined the communist movement in the first place, and all of a sudden became, you know, anti-war on the basis of this kind of Anglo-French war. But again, this was not to be the last of the dramatic about faces. Just a year and a half later, in 1941, when Hitler invaded the USSR, now the Soviet Union entered the war and the Comintern changed its line again. So dumped all that stuff back to the anti-fascist war. But even more than it being just a general kind of anti-fascist war, it was an anti-fascist war in which all the communist parties across the world had to throw all of their energy, enthusiasm. They must join the militaries across the world. Communists were encouraged to join and to not just because, many communists might join militaries, for different reasons to agitate and so on. But part of the point of them joining the militaries across the world was to encourage pro-war sentiment. It was to encourage, a deep commitment amongst soldiers to this so-called anti-fascist war, which was in fact just an imperialist war. And so across the world, this kind of nationalism came to the fore. So, for instance, in Australia, the Internationale was replaced by God Save the King. And that was the first song that was played at the start of Communist Party meetings. And then the Internationale kind of came much later. And you can kind of see here, again, this is a little bit later, but this is from the US. Communist veterans defend America in peace as in war. So you really get a kind of flavor for the kind of, the nationalism which comes to dominate many of the communist parties across the world. So now we come to the rub, because this is 1941. This is the moment that all the Stalinists kind of talk about as being, the heroic kind of Stalin punching Hitler kind of moment. And what they might actually say at this point is, well, I don't agree with all of the things that the USSR did before the war, of course. Maybe there were little problems here or there. But if they hadn't entered the war, then militarily, fascism would have definitely won the day. Now, I would kind of respond to this argument on a few fronts. Firstly, I would insist that the history and formal military battles of World War II cannot be abstracted from the history and politics of the pre-war period. Secondly, I would point to the ways in which the war against the Nazis wasn't actually just won by the military strength and prowess of the Red Army. And this is because World War II was quite a contradictory beast. For the Allied powers, the war was a straight up imperial battle, which they wanted to be fought in a traditional military manner. In a number of countries, however, the war ended up being much more than that. And in countries that were occupied by fascist forces, such as Poland, Greece, Italy, France, Belgium, Norway, Czechoslovakia, Albania, and Holland, there were significant partisan and local resistance movements, which did a huge amount to actually undermine the fascist movements and military forces in those countries. So these aren't traditional kind of battles where the Red Army kind of leads the way and so on. There are internal domestic dynamics in many of these countries. Now, lots of those movements were quite socially and politically mixed. But they did contribute to the defeat of the fascist forces in their countries. And unlike in traditional militaries, there was actually lots more room inside the dynamics of the partisan resistance and the broader domestic anti-fascist movement in these countries to transform and become much more radical. And in some countries, the resistance to the fascists during the war had an explicitly working class character, and many millions of working class people were mobilized in some way, shape, or form to actively resist. And they were not doing this under the auspices of the Red Army. They weren't part of the Red Army. And in lots of instances, they actually wanted guns that the Red Army refused to give them. And so this meant for like many millions of these people, they felt like they were fighting not just for their country as their rulers would want it, but for a post-war society that they could have some say over. And I think, well, it's absolutely impossible for me to kind of give an overview of the histories of the communist movements in each of these countries and the ways in which they related to the partisan movements themselves. But suffice it to say that the politics of the communist parties played a vital role in these movements of defeat. So in Italy, for instance, The radical component of the resistance movement had been very strong. Communist Party members had been very brave and intrepid in the struggle, and many of them didn't see why they should limit their struggle to simply ending fascist rule. Nevertheless, at the end of the war, the Communist Party leadership, instructed by the Comintern, dissolved the resistance organisations as basically a goodwill gesture to Stalin, to FDR and to Churchill. And they told resistance fighters to bury their guns, to return to work and life on the land, and accept that the rich and powerful would now decide the shape and contours of post-war Italy. And if people ever have a chance, you should definitely watch the amazing film Novecento or 900, which basically details this whole period, and it ends with just the most awful, gut-wrenching moment when many of these partisan radical fighters basically bury their guns because they're told to by the local Communist Party leadership under the directions of the Comintern. Nevertheless, the claim is still made, despite the fact that the military battles weren't everything, and that the Comintern actually played an important role in undermining the struggles of the anti-fascists in the partisan movements. The claim is still made that the Red Army defeated Hitler and therefore fascism. And I suppose we've got to say, in purely military terms, the Red Army did play an actually important role in the broader Allied battle against the fascists. No one would deny that. The various military battles fought in 1943 and 1945 were important. The USSR deployed their superior numbers across a number of key fronts in the war, and that resulted undeniably in undermining German military strength. But the military defeat of Germany should have formally ended the war, right? If it was an anti-fascist war, that's what it was about. But because the war wasn't actually about anti-fascism, it was an imperialist war. Therefore, the defeat of Hitler in Germany didn't actually stop the Allies from dropping nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And it didn't stop the broader kind of Pacific War from ending immediately, because actually the war was about a much broader kind of inter-imperial battle. And I think more fundamentally, though, the kind of broader picture of the war, if we understand that fascism was a result of the kind of dynamics of capitalist crisis in the 1930s, emerged and brought to military life across the world in the Second World War, we have to understand that Stalinism did absolutely nothing to undermine the fundamental dynamics of what gave rise to fascism in the first place. And it did not just did nothing, it killed the capacity for an independent, genuinely revolutionary anti-fascist working class movement to exist at the time. So, that was the result. So I just want to kind of conclude by saying, now, obviously, fascism is a scourge. As a movement, it represented disaster and danger for the world's working class on just unimaginably barbaric scales. But to combat fascism, we need an uncompromising politics, a politics that understands that it's literally only the revolutionary struggle of workers that can halt a mass fascist movement, not the tin pot little fascists that we kind of see across the world today. But Stalinism as a mass material force, today obviously doesn't exist in the same way that it did during this period. Nevertheless, the kind of politics of compromise, of class collaboration, of authoritarianism, of looking towards strong states to kind of protect and, basically push back far-right forces, all of these things still exist today. And so I think, understanding the kind of dynamic and politics of, the Stalinist, movements and the Stalinist states is an absolutely, vital part of being able to challenge the kind of forces that we see across us today.